hoping now's a good time. So for those of us who have played some video games, I'm sure that this image at the top here is maybe a familiar one. It's from the video game called Among Us. And so this idea of having imposters among us is it's kind of comically portrayed here. So you can see here that we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome today. So I've had the opportunity to give this talk a few times to different professional bodies and professional audiences. And this is actually my first time giving this talk to the general public. So I'm very excited. And I'm very happy that you're joining me on a Friday night. And that means a lot to me that you're taking time out of your day to join me on yet another Zoom meeting. So thank you for joining me today. So my name is Dr. Brenda Lee. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of BC, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And so I want to take a moment to just give some disclosures and acknowledgement. So this presentation doesn't reflect the views of BCPA or of my employer, Vancouver Coastal Health. And I'm not receiving any compensations for the current presentation. I'm not averse to it, but they're just not paying me. So this is publicly shared, so I hope you enjoy it. And I have no conflicts of interest to declare today. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm a settler and a first-generation immigrant. And I've had the immense privilege of living across this beautiful swath of land that we call Canada, across many different nations. So right now I live in unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, often known as Vancouver, British Columbia. So thank you for joining me online today. And if you feel comfortable, I would love to know where you're coming from. If you want to type that into the chat, I kind of want to see how widely we're represented here today. Whether that's the particular city name or whether that's the First Nations territories that you're aware of. So lots of answers coming in here. Wow, okay, wonderful. I see some folks joining us from my my alma mater from Fredericton. Welcome. Wow, we've got some Americans in the house. Thank you for joining us. Okay, and lots of folks from BC. Coquitlam. Wow, shout out to New York City, a lovely city, one that I wish to visit again someday. So thank you all for sharing. Welcome, and glad to have you join us. So some housekeeping duties, or rules rather. So once again, if you're just joining us in the meeting now, please make sure that your mic is on mute, and that's just to make sure that we have no major disruptions. If you have any questions, please feel free to share it in the chat. And Alicia from BCPA is joining us today and is going to be moderating those comments and also posing them to me. And I'll be happy to answer them throughout the course of this talk. And I'm going to be asking you to write down some things. Ooh, not quite there yet. I'm going to be asking you to write down some things in terms of some self-reflection and also some notes for yourself. So now would be a good time for you to grab some paper and something to write with. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to do that. Your cell phone works too if you pull up your notes app. So today I'm going to be broadly covering the who, what, when, where, why, how of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. And so we're going to start off with a what, and then we're going to move on to who experiences it, when and where it tends to occur, how it can be or why it can be a helpful sign for us, and also how to overcome it and to harness it for good. So with that kind of broadly stated, I would love it if you type into the chat, what is one question that you have about imposter syndrome that you're hoping will be answered by this presentation? Absolutely. Does it go away? Not many of us don't like it. It doesn't feel good. Yeah, definitely. How to overcome it. Do other people feel like this? That's a big one. Yeah, whether there's any gender differences. Yeah, how it gets in the way for us and our professional goals or our academic goals. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. Yeah, and these are really common questions and some big ones that I had myself when I first looked into this topic a few years ago and started putting together this presentation. So I would encourage you to hold on to this question and anyone that you may not have typed down into the chat. And just make sure that if it's somehow not addressed or maybe not fully addressed by the end of this presentation, that you just type it in again, and I'll make sure that I try to address it before we wrap up today as well. So we're actually going to start off by watching a short video. And so I'm going to attempt to share this video, and if folks don't hear the audio, please let me know.
Even after writing 11 books and winning several prestigious awards, Maya Angelou couldn't escape the nagging doubt that she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. Accomplishments at the level of Angelou's or Einstein's are rare, but their feeling of fraudulence is extremely common. Why can't so many of us shake feelings that we haven't earned our accomplishments, or that our ideas and skills aren't worthy of others' attention? Psychologist Pauline Rose Clance was the first to study this unwarranted sense of insecurity. In her work as a therapist, she noticed many of her undergraduate patients shared a concern. Though they had high grades, they didn't believe they deserved their spots at the university. Some even believed their acceptance had been an admissions error. While Clance knew these fears were unfounded, she could also remember feeling the exact same way in graduate school. She and her patients experienced something that goes by a number of names: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. Together with colleague Suzanne Imes, Clance first studied imposterism in female college students and faculty. Their work established pervasive feelings of fraudulence in this group. Since that first study, the same thing has been established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations, though it may be more prevalent and disproportionately affect the experiences of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. To call it a syndrome is to downplay how universal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem. Where do these feelings of fraudulence come from? People who are highly skilled or accomplished tend to think others are just as skilled. This can spiral into feelings that they don't deserve accolades and opportunities over other people. And as Angelou and Einstein experienced, there's often no threshold of accomplishment that puts these feelings to rest. Feelings of imposterism aren't restricted to highly skilled individuals either. Everyone is susceptible to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where we each doubt ourselves privately, but believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else voices their doubts. Since it's tough to really know how hard our peers work, how difficult they find certain tasks, or how much they doubt themselves, there's no easy way to dismiss feelings that we're less capable than the people around us. Intense feelings of imposterism can prevent people from sharing their great ideas or applying for jobs and programs where they'd excel. At least so far, the most surefire way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Many people suffering from imposter syndrome are afraid that if they ask about their performance, their fears will be confirmed. And even when they receive positive feedback, it often fails to ease feelings of fraudulence. But on the other hand, hearing that an advisor or mentor has experienced feelings of imposterism can help relieve those feelings. The same goes for peers. Even simply finding out there's a term for these feelings can be an incredible relief. Once you're aware of the phenomenon, you can combat your own imposter syndrome by collecting and revisiting positive feedback. One scientist who kept blaming herself for problems in her lab started to document the causes every time something went wrong. Eventually, she realized most of the problems came from equipment failure and came to recognize her own competence. We may never be able to banish these feelings entirely, but we can have open conversations about academic or professional challenges. With increasing awareness of how common these experiences are, perhaps we can feel freer to be frank about our feelings and build confidence in some simple truths. You have talent, you are capable, and you belong. Everyone can use a little extra kick of confidence sometimes. Find out some tips and tricks for boosting yours with this video.
Okay, wonderful. And so if you're back with us after that video, please just type a Y into the chat. Okay, great. I'm seeing the Y's button. Wonderful. Welcome back. And so that's the entirety of the talk. Thanks for joining me. I'm totally kidding. Of course, I love that video because I find it very validating. And I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, oh man, okay. So I joined the esteemed ranks of Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou and feeling like an imposter. And so I find that it can be very validating to know that it is, it's something that can be experienced by us in the start of our professional careers all the way up to the heights of it, which, depending on the way that you read it, is both kind of validating at the same time, also kind of like, oh man, am I going to continue feeling like this for a while? And I know that that's the question that some of us had at the start there. So let me continue here. So this is a picture that, a meme, a picture on the internet, and at the top there it just says, I hope this email finds you well. And then on the bottom there is a picture of a dog, sitting in the midst of a lot of fire. And the caption says, how the email found me. And one thing of fire says deadlines, another one says fatigue, and another one says imposter syndrome. And for those of us that live on the internet, we know this dog as the "this is fine" dog. And so this is just a little bit of a humorous take on the fact that we are all experiencing all the stressors that we usually have, and also the flaming mess that is COVID right now, and and all the different things that can come with that as well. And I want to also say that I really love how much in the past few years imposter syndrome has become part of the popular conversation, because it means that there's great memes and tweets and jokes that I can pull for presentations. And you're going to see them sprinkled pretty liberally throughout the presentation today. So especially as stresses are heightened now over the past year and extending beyond that in front of us, I think it's going to be so important for us to laugh with and also support one another during these times. So what is imposter phenomenon? Now, we've seen in the video that in 1978, there were two psychologists by the name of Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes that first identified what they called the imposter phenomenon in studies of high achieving women. So they described it as an internal experience of intellectual phoniness. Now, those experiencing imposter feelings will find it difficult to internalize their achievements and are reluctant to think of their success as being due to intrinsic skills or intelligence. Now, this is despite evidence to the contrary. They tend to think of their successes based on fleeting circumstances, such as luck or other people's error, or working distinctly very hard. Now, those with imposter feelings often live in fear of being exposed as being a fraud and consequently hold themselves to very high standards. And imposter feelings arise in places of achievement, such as at workplaces, at schools, and so forth, where judgments are made about your merit. So you don't feel like an imposter at the public library or on the subway, unless if those are the places where you work, of course. It might be tempting to think that the hoops that you jumped through in school or on the job market, that they weren't real, but they were. And looking back on them, it might be tempting to think that you walked around them instead of through them, but nobody actually does. A good way to summarize imposter phenomenon is that despite all of someone's external achievements, they still feel like they don't belong. Which just goes to show you that feeling like an imposter doesn't have much to do with what you have done, and it has everything to do with how you feel and how you have been made to feel. So let's start off by talking a little bit more about terminology. So what we're talking about today has been given a few different names. So you might hear me using these different terms interchangeably. I'm also going to talk about why I don't love the term imposter syndrome, because it implies that you're somehow sick with a syndrome for having these feelings, which is simply not true, as you'll come to see. So remember how I talked about how I don't love the term imposter syndrome? That's because research has shown that we can all experience imposterism or imposter feelings at different times. In fact, research suggests that up to 82% of us have experienced imposter thoughts, and that was a meta-analysis done in 2020, which means that some researchers pulled together research done over 60 years, or since the start of this phenomenon was starting to be looked at. So calling this a syndrome is like calling sadness or hunger or being ticklish a syndrome, which is making it an illness or a sickness when that is simply not the case, and it is a part of human experience. Of course, research has also shown that there are personal things, so that is things within ourselves that can affect how much we feel like an imposter. So one of the first personal factors I wanted to talk about is self-efficacy. Now, that's a fancy way for us to describe confidence in ourselves and our abilities. And we can think of it as a combination of the skills that you have and experiences of success that you've had. So let's say that you're new in a job. So you might have all the prerequisite skills and still feel like an imposter because you have not had experiences of success within your role yet. If you give it a couple of months or a couple of years, you might feel differently. Another personal factor is maladaptive perfectionism. So those of us with perfectionistic tendencies are more likely to feel like imposters. And so I like to joke that grad school is just like rife with imposter syndrome because we are all there because we've been perfectionists and got there, riding on the coattails in some ways of perfectionism, but we are also experiencing the negative aspects of it. So this is also a feedback loop, we know, because feelings of imposterism can mean that you're seeking more validation from other people, and then you become more sensitive to criticism, and you might ruminate, that is, you might chew and think about less than perfect performances that you've had. And that also makes you really wonder and think over and over again about mistakes that you have made. So although we can experience this to some degree, all of us, this can lead to what we call perfectionistic self-presentation, where we're more concerned about looking like we have the skills more than we actually care about getting the skills, which we'll talk more about throughout this presentation, because that tendency to want to look like we belong, as opposed to trying to actually learn the skills that will help us be better at our jobs, is a real crutch that can get in our way. Imposterism is also linked to mental health difficulties, such as depression and anxiety. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. And those of us who believe ourselves to be imposters may experience more negative emotions. And together with the tendency to attribute failure internally and to believe that our successes are external to us, and to believe that when we fail, it means that there's something wrong with us or that it attacks the way that we think about ourselves. This is very similar to the thought biases that we see in anxiety and in depression and similar kinds of difficulties. It's also very important for us to look at social and systemic factors that contribute to imposterism. Now, there's starting to be more public conversations around imposter syndrome, and that's been crossed with social movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which has deepened our understanding about who may be stuck in these imposter feelings for longer and have it negatively affect them more. So here is an example of a recent interview with epidemiologist Sarah Claiborne, who talked about experiencing imposterism as a Black woman within her field of public health and about how that extends beyond her. So this was an interview with the CBC back July of last year. So although psychological research on imposterism typically focuses on feelings and perceptions and things within individuals, I think it's very important for us to address and to know that there are certain groups of people who are more likely to be disenfranchised and to feel like imposters. So we know that imposterism hits particularly hard among professionals who are members of minority groups, and that's broadly defined, such as ethnic minority groups. And we also know that studies in universities and in higher education found that those who are studying topics that are marginalized within academic culture feel imposterism more strongly. So in other words, some of us don't just feel like imposters. We are made to feel like imposters. So this is in spite of how self-assured or smart or confident we may be. So while imposter syndrome may affect everyone at some point in their professional lives, some of us are disproportionately unsupported in overcoming it. This has led to some social psychologists to call for attacking imposterism by tackling the contextual roots. So for example, how can we decrease persistent stereotypes within society, or to increase diversity across different occupations and different leadership levels, and also ensuring that there's equal treatment of different kinds of groups, including those with minority status. And also to kind of summarize it all, we do know that folks across different kinds of, social positions and kind of folks with different identities, women, men, graduate students, doctors and residents, there's been quite a bit of research about physicians, managers, employees, everyone can feel like an imposter at times. And so I'm going to do this exercise, and this is very impactful when I do it in person in a group of people, because I ask everyone to stand up, and then I ask you to sit down when you have had the particular thought that I bring up on the screen. And it's a very visual way to show and to see for yourself how pervasive imposter thoughts are. And so, if you're feeling brave, I would encourage you to type a Y or to, type something into the chat when your imposter thought comes up. And I'm also going to give you a few moments at the end of the slide to write down for yourself what your internal imposter tells you if you don't see this exact thought come up on the slide. So the first thought is, I shouldn't speak because someone knows more about this than I do. Seeing some Y's come up there. I got this job on technicality. I don't know what I'm doing. That one hits people. Yeah, I see that. I'm not ready for this role. I'm the worst member on my team. I only won that scholarship or that award or that grant because nobody else applied. They only complimented me on my work to be nice. I have to work even harder now so that they won't find me out. I don't deserve my successes. My supervisor will soon find out that I'm not cut out for this opportunity or this job or this role. This program or job or opportunity that wants me must not be very good. And my job is tough because I'm not good enough. So thank you all for your vulnerability and for your openness. And so I'm going to give you a few moments to write down for yourself what your internal imposter tells you, whether it is word for word one of these thoughts that's on the screen right now, or whether it is a little bit different, or whether it's completely different. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, that's very brave to share that. Yeah. Thank you. I think my most recent imposter thought is like, I can't believe that they are, well, this is the last time that I gave this presentation. I can't believe they're paying me to talk about imposter syndrome. Like, how have I pulled the wool over their eyes, right? Thank you all for your openness to share. Yeah, absolutely. And so thank you. I think this Jennifer's comment there. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide here, but please continue sharing as you feel comfortable. So this is a tweet by a user named Martin, who's typed, meta imposter syndrome. When you know a lot of people have imposter syndrome, but you've witnessed how confident they are. So they're not like you, the real imposter. So I'm just going to take a pause here and check in with Alicia and see if there's any thoughts or any questions that may have come up. And I know that there's been a lot of comments since the start there. Has there been anything that I may have missed?
I don't think so. I think a few brave souls have kind of been sharing their own imposter syndrome thoughts based on the few that were brave enough to start the ball, but no questions right now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And thank you all for sharing. And we'll come to talk about this a little bit more in depth. But we do know that one of the best ways to overcome imposter syndrome is to be open about our experiences, especially if we're in positions of power. So we're definitely going to get there. And so your openness and your vulnerability is an attribute to you. And so we're going to talk about when imposter syndrome and imposter thoughts tend to come up. So right now, I'm pulling from a study that is researching imposterism within academic faculty. So this is literally folks that are considered experts, subject area experts within their fields. And this was a research done in 2017. And so they asked them, when do these imposter thoughts tend to come up for you? And so these incidents, the first of which is when their expertise is in question, and whether this is by colleagues or by themselves or by students. So another situation where imposter thoughts came up for this particular group is when they experience successes. And so when they got that grant they wanted, or they got, a particular support of a funder, or they, had their research published, or they got media exposure, for example. And if you're hearing that clatter in the background, it is a very excited dog, so please don't mind him. Imposter thoughts also came up for folks when there's comparison with or among their colleagues. And imposter thoughts also came up as part of their regular productivity. So these researchers described that imposter thoughts came up when they were working on their research proposals, when they were submitting this research, and they were submitting grants for review, when they were receiving negative feedback or getting rejection for different submissions. So although many of us are not subject area experts, or our imposter thoughts may tell us that we're not, I think what really stood out for me in this line of research is that throughout every aspect of your work, imposter thoughts can come up. Like, that's what really struck me. So I think it's really helpful for us then to think about when they specifically tend to come up for you. So take a moment to think about that. Even think about, when was the last time these thoughts came up for you? Did it come up when you were getting feedback from a supervisor, perhaps? Or maybe when you were speaking up in a meeting? Oof, I know that's a big one for me. Like, who am I to speak up when there's this table full of other people who know more than I do? I know that's a big one for me. So if you take a minute and just note down on your piece of paper or on your phone, wherever it might be, the situations that tend to be difficult for you for imposter thoughts. Now, I'm going to be a bit of contrarian here, and I'm going to pose the different reasons why imposterism can be helpful for us. And I know that they can be the bane of our existence. And at the same time, they can also be quite helpful in posing signs of things that we should pay attention to. So we do know that when imposter thoughts are unchecked, that it can negatively aspect all stages of folks in different parts of their careers. So we know that across different stages of careers, that imposterism that is really strong and unchecked can lead to impaired job performance. It can lead to lower job satisfaction and lead to higher burnout. So of course, then it's important for us to acknowledge it and to catch it as opposed to pushing it away and ignoring it. Otherwise, we can let it get away from us and lead to some negative consequences. So although these fear of failures and fear of success and difficulties can be found in people across different stages of their professional lives, we know that imposter feelings actually have the most negative effect on career planning and career striving in students and early level professionals, which means that the way that you see your professional life and your professional future may be tinted and squished by imposter phenomenon. So for folks who are more established, once again, tying into that research, looking at folks who are researchers and subject area experts, they question themselves and compare their work with their colleagues and may find it more difficult to receive feedback in consequence and also to take research risks. And research looking at working professionals has found that it can lead to a negative impact on your sense of motivation to take on leadership roles. And it can contribute to feelings of emotional exhaustion, which can spill over into our personal lives. And overall, it can be connected to lower job satisfaction, which we've mentioned, and also lower organizational citizenship behavior, which is kind of a complicated way of saying, contributing to all those different things that make workplaces really lovely. For example, engaging in conversations that are supportive towards other coworkers, taking on roles that may be a little bit above and beyond our kind of stated job requirements and so forth. So given that we can all experience imposter thoughts, it's important to note these things before they get out of hand. So I've put down a tweet here from earlier in the fall last year. And this was the day after one of the, I believe was the very first presidential debates down in the US. And so Audrey, this user, said, "This debate has cured my imposter syndrome." And I don't know about you, but I get very salty when I see someone who I think, man, you could use more imposter syndrome in your life. So I think this tweet captures that pretty perfectly. So of course, we can't control what others feel and don't feel. However, we can change the way that imposterism affects us. So we're going to talk about the 3 different ways that we can manage imposter thoughts. The first is to acknowledge and normalize it, and then reframing strongly held thoughts that may be unhelpful for us, and then engaging in active coping. And we'll go through all of these in turn. So I have this pie chart image up here, and the caption says, "Everyone feels like an imposter sometimes, and that's okay." And the pie chart is split into 3 different pieces. The first piece there on the left in green says people who get imposter syndrome. The bottom triangle down there in orange says other people who get imposter syndrome. And on the right-hand side in blue, literally everyone else, they also get imposter syndrome. And so this is really, once again, to normalize that experience of imposter phenomenon, because it is something that we do know through research that the majority of us experience. In fact, I'm going to read a few quotes that I've come across either in my research for this presentation or by other participants. And so someone said, "When someone first says you are wrong, my first thought is maybe I overlooked something, even though I've studied this to death." Another person said, "There's something about the title expert that makes my stomach drop at first when I receive a request for an interview. I force myself to do it, but there is always that hesitation with the title expert that makes me pause a little bit every time." And this quote I really love because it hits so strongly for me. This person says, "I just remember thinking, oh my God, she is so smart and she can just pull this stuff out of her head, and feeling like I don't know anything. And I remember thinking, yeah, I'm just going to nod and hope that she doesn't get any clue that I am clueless. So I don't know if any one of you found any of these quotes echoing your own experiences. And I know that for my own personal, educational, and professional lives, that imposter voice has always been there, although it says different things at different times, to be honest. For example, when I was, in my undergrad, it said, "You didn't do an honors degree." And then when I was in early grad school, it was, "You didn't take advanced statistics." And then everyone knows what's going on except for you. And I mean, for all the grad students in the audience, no, nobody knows what's going on. It feels like it, but nobody else knows what's going on. And then as I started working with clients, that voice said, "You're too young to work with parents, or you're too young to be working with veterans. What do you know?" And like I shared a little bit earlier, the most recent thoughts that really struck me were, I can't believe they're paying me to present on imposter syndrome, or I can't believe my professional association is having me talk about something. Like, what if I just come off looking like an idiot? And so these thoughts are really normal. They are vicious and they're really normal. And we'll talk more about how to manage them and how to make them sting less and also work more for us. So talking to other people is the single best way to normalize imposter thoughts, because we know that the most central fear in imposter thoughts is that we are alone and that we have to be alone because feeling this way is our big secret. So given that we all now are in on the secret that everyone experiences imposter thoughts at times, talking about it actually normalizes and neutralizes this very common experience. So this is especially impactful for those of us in supervisory positions, as research has found that supervisors that talk about their experiences of imposterism with their supervisees strongly help their supervisees' imposter feelings. And so this also ties into coaching and mentoring, which helps in multiple ways. If you find someone to coach and mentor, you can find it really fulfilling, first of all, but also being somebody's mentor can help you solidify and appreciate all of your hard-earned skills and knowledge in a way that is really hard to do if you're not imparting that towards somebody else. And we've started alluding to this, is that workplace social support can be really important. It actually buffers the negative effects of imposter thoughts on job satisfaction and on that organizational citizenship behavior that I mentioned earlier. So one way that you may decide to do this is to create what I call your own team of advisors. So these are people who really see you and can honestly tell you things about yourself and about your professional environment. Excuse me. And in that spirit, I think it's really important to trust your advisors, these people that you trust, as much, if not more than you trust that imposter voice within yourself. So if someone you respect gives you a compliment, it means I have to hear this without outright dismissing it. If I respect this person, it means I will respect their opinion about me, even when my imposter thought tells me that they are being nice or they are being, exaggerating my good traits. And also on the flip side as well, I think it's important to ignore the haters. And that's just kind of a casual way of saying, like, people who are not in your committee, like people who are not necessarily in that same field as you, or people who are not invested in your well-being professionally. I think it's important to not take those comments to heart so much that you disregard the positive and helpful messages that you get from people within your advisor group. So once again, I'm going to give you a few seconds. Just think about, who is one person that I can talk about imposter thoughts with after this presentation. So whether that's, a partner, whether that's your dog, whether that's a coworker, or hell, if you're really wonderful and keen, if you have a supervisee, would you consider talking with them about your imposter thoughts? So as someone who's been trained a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy, for those of us who are in the know or within the psychological field, all that is to say is it's a way of working with clients where we really examine the way that we think and how that can get us in trouble, and how that affects our mental health. And so you really see that on this slide here today, is all the different ways that we can kind of poke at our thinking when it's getting us in trouble. So in this particular case, in terms of imposter thoughts. So the first way that we can reframe our thinking to try to not have it stop us in our professional lives is to think about comparing like to like. So what I mean by that is, are you, for example, are you an early career professional? For example, I am. Like, we probably don't know as much about navigating our workplaces or managing our time or our specific work tasks as someone who's been there for 10 years or 20 years. That makes sense. Don't confuse your capacity to learn in a workplace and to improve with somebody else's pre-existing knowledge. The next way to reframe is to focus on what you have accomplished in and of itself, as opposed to comparing it to something that you had hoped to accomplish. So not a single one of us can say that we have crossed everything off our to-do list forever, although I would like to think so. Reframing our narrative as one of thinking about the concrete accomplishments that we have shifts your focus to what you've already done and what you've already accomplished, and away from wanting to always chase after more, which can really make us miserable. The next way we can reframe is to be realistic about the nature of our work. So depending on your workplace, performance feedback is part of the process of all workplaces generally. And especially for academic arenas, for example, you're there to receive feedback that's meant to improve your work. And for all of us, most well-meaning managers or supervisors will emphasize what you can change to try to help improve your work. That's part of their responsibility. So hopefully they will also emphasize what you're doing well, but that's often not the case. And so unfortunately, there is a bias in our workplaces to focus on what we could be doing better, as opposed to all the things that we're doing well. And so knowing that that bias is there is really important, because then if we don't get the same level of positive feedback as we're getting constructive criticism, there's a reason for that. It's built into our workplaces. And something else as well is that ultimately we only need one job at a time or one task at a time. So by definition, that may mean for some of us a huge ratio of rejections to acceptances. It might be built into our work once again, that it's like, you can only carry this thing at one time, or this task can only go to one person. And so that may be part of your cycle of production at work, that it's going to be produce, rejection, revise, acceptance, and over and over and over again. And it's normal, and it's a part of that workplace. And so if that is a part of your workplace, it's important to keep that in mind. Another way that we want to think about reframing is to stay concrete. So what I mean by that is that imposter syndrome feeds off of generalities. So a lot of the times, the thoughts that tell us, I'm not good enough, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not charismatic, or funny, or self-assured enough. Like, what's enough anyway? Who is all of those things? I mean, what the heck does good mean anyway, in the context of these thoughts, right? So instead of wallowing in these like vague self-doubts, it's important to reframe them to be more specific. So for example, I have some improvements to make about my presentation skills, or my writing can be more clear. That way you have something concrete to work with and to work on, as opposed to just beating yourself with a hammer internally. And next, I want us to think about approaching our tasks using a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And so that is thinking about all the ways that we can improve and to learn, as opposed to thinking about ourselves having to go in with everything already fixed in place. So if we approach our task thinking, what can I learn from this? It is more likely going to soften our approach and make it easier for us to absorb what we actually want to learn in that situation. And so I've put a graph down here, and the first on the left side, there is an orange circle that says what I think other people know, and then it completely encompasses the blue circle in the middle, which says what I know. And so part of the growth mindset and part of reframing is moving towards that right-hand side, where there's a Venn diagram between what I know and what other people know, knowing that there is overlap and there's also unique differences. And that's what contributes to a strong, healthy team, is that overlapping and yet distinct set of skills. So reframing is going to help us see ourselves in terms of the bigger picture and also see ourselves in context. Because as I mentioned before, it's going to be important for us to think about all the different ways that even as we're very confident and self-assured and skilled, that there can still be outside of things that are outside of us that can contribute to that imposter phenomenon. If you feel like an imposter because you don't know something or you can't do a particular thing, think about what that thing is. Like, is that skill or content actually crucial to your work? If so, what do you have to do to acquire it? Not because you want to pass, but because you want to make yourself be more effective and productive. And if that particular skill doesn't actually matter, think about why it is that other people might have it who are in your role and you don't, assuming that you actually don't have it and you're not just being hard on yourself or inflating other people's skill sets. So maybe there's real and good reasons why this wasn't part of your background or part of your education. So an example that I like to give is, prior to, in my past life, before I became a psychologist, when I was younger, I used to run a music website, and I had a lot of colleagues in music journalism. And as you may have guessed from my introduction, I didn't grow up. Much of my childhood was spent outside of North America. And so a lot of my musical education wasn't in the Beatles or the Ramones or Rolling Stones or these different bands that influence a lot of popular North American music. And I used to feel really self-conscious about that. I used to be like, oh, I have to be able to name drop these big bands that, that all of my colleagues know. And it took me a long time for me to embrace the fact that I come from a different cultural background and I come from a different musical background. And that is my skill set, and that is what my unique contribution is to the kinds of writing that I was doing. So once again, in that particular situation, my background was quite different, and that added to both my imposter thoughts as well as the ways that I could contribute. Kind of tying into that, I want us to think about the factors that contribute to you feeling like an imposter. So what are the different demographics of your profession? The history of your field? Like, are you what people expect from, a student or a profession within your area? So I'm just going to pull this up here. If you know who this person is, type their name into the chat. I'm curious. Yeah. Okay, great. Awesome. Oh, we got some Freud fans here. Okay, well done. So yeah, many of you know that this is Dr. Sigmund Freud, who is an Austrian psychiatrist, who's one of the most well-known folks within the psychological/psychiatric field, one of the forefathers. And of course, when you look at Sigmund Freud, and then you look at me, and look back at Freud and look at me again. There's very little commonalities in terms of the way that we look. And so when folks think about mental health professionals, they often have a picture in mind, and it looks more like Sigmund Freud than it looks like Brenda Lee. And historically, they've looked more like Sigmund Freud than they've looked like me. And so our personal identities and our life experiences are often major assets to us. And also it can get in our way if it doesn't match that expectation of people having, what people have for your profession. And at the same time, it's important for us to remember that these other people's first impressions of us are not the same as our self-worth, and they're not the same as our skill set. And it's very important for us to, here, go ahead here. It's very important for us to take pride in and to learn to voice the additional challenges that go with being a forerunner. This is one of the quotes I came upon in my research for this presentation. And it was very powerful for me to hear this because as I was reading this particular writer, they were talking about how there's a very eminent scholar that talked about how for every marginalized identity that you can claim, you have to add 1 year onto the time that it will take you to finish your dissertation. And so this is a little bit grad student specific, but it really was a powerful moment that quantified the extra labor, that is emotional labor, physical labor, psychological, intellectual, that it takes to exist in a field that may be quite homogenous. So for example, I've given this talk numerous times to engineers and to women who are engineers, and they talk about how much that field is homogenous and how they don't see themselves in the typical professional within their field. So all the extra work that you're going to face is because others see you as an imposter, but not because you actually are. So in other words, if you find yourself feeling like an imposter, it might be because you are trespassing on a territory that implicitly belonged to people who don't look or act or think like you. So I'm going to take a moment here and just read this tweet by Sam Sykes. And so he wrote here, "I'm not good enough," implies that this is as good as you'll ever be. It doesn't acknowledge your hard work, and it ends your journey. Punching the ground and declaring, I must get stronger, like in anime. It sets goals, it recognizes how far you've come, and it's useful for defeating Demon King. So I love this tweet and this person's particular brand of reframing. So I'm just going to leave it up here for a moment and stop to see if there are any questions or any comments that would be good for me to address. Alicia?
There was one that came up along the way from Andrew. I'm not sure if you're going to address this later in your presentation, but it was a curiosity around the relationship, if any, around performance anxiety and imposter syndrome.
So I'm not hearing Alicia, so I'm assuming that there's major questions, if I can assume that. If you have any, please plunk them into the chat. Once again, you know, we have some time to talk about any questions that may come up. Oh my goodness, I can't hear you. Well, that doesn't help us with question asking. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so all right. So Alicia brought up a question to me in the chat saying, what is the relationship, if there is one, between imposter syndrome and performance anxiety? Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And it's not something that I've come across specifically within the research itself, although there has been links between imposter syndrome and anxiety more broadly. So performance anxiety, for those of us who may not know the term, is talking about anxiety or tension or nervousness that's experienced in the context of performance. So for example, giving a speech or, you know, performing, like, let's say at a dance recital or other situations where your performance is being looked at by, you know, other folks. And so in this particular question, you know, the link between imposter syndrome and anxiety, there definitely seems to be an intuitive link there, although I haven't come across any research specifically addressing such. Once again, you know, imposter syndrome is definitely linked to a lot of that negative emotions that we see with mood and anxiety disorders. Although, once again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have depression or have anxiety because you feel imposter phenomenon. Any other questions that I can address at this point in time? Okay. Yeah, so I see a question by Rebecca here. Can imposter syndrome manifest physically, like tics and habits? Yeah, so once again, just to bring it back, imposter syndrome, not a term I love because it implies that there is an illness there when we know that it is a very common experience. It's like saying that, being ticklish or being hungry is a syndrome, like hunger syndrome or something like that, when we know that that's simply not the case. And so for yourself, for each of us, and for those of us who experience, for example, something like a verbal tic or anything like that, if that is something that comes out when you're feeling anxious or feeling nervous, it is likely going to come out if you're experiencing imposter thoughts, if that's something that's making you anxious as well. Yeah. I also definitely need myself being drawn as an anime character. So if anybody is offering, please, put that into the chat, make yourselves known. I will make sure that you do not feel like an imposter at drawing anime characters. Okay, so I'm just going to continue. And we're going to talk about active coping now. And so this is really where my psychologist hat comes on. These are some of the tips and tricks that I have found both supported within the literature as well as just some clinical tricks that I know can be quite helpful with imposter thoughts, and also generalizing a little bit more as well into some coping techniques with anxiety as well. So first of all, we want to talk about the flooding response. And so what does flooding mean? So flooding is an experience of emotional overwhelm, and it actually has a lot of physical sensations associated with it as well. For example, for many of us, we may experience what many of us know as the fight or flight or freeze response. That is when kind of all your muscles tense up, you start feeling clammy, maybe your face gets flushed, there's like a rush of blood to the head where it feels like your head is pounding, and there's that roar within your ears, and it's hard to hear anything else, and your heart is just racing, like pounding in your chest. And so that is a telltale sign that you have been really activated by some kind of feedback that you got, and that strong emotional reaction has kicked in. So whether that's because of the content of the feedback, or because the relationship that you have with the person that's giving you the feedback, or even the state of mind that you're in, all these things can kind of intersect to really just bowl you over and make you really overwhelmed by the feedback that you may have received. Whether the feedback is right or wrong, whether it's wise or dumb, something about it has caused your identity, or the sense of who you are, to come a little bit undone and a little bit shifted. And so when we're flooded, we actually feel overwhelmed, we feel threatened, we can even feel ashamed or feel really off balance. And so when we're in this flooded state, a nuanced discussion of that feedback is not in the cards. We're actually just psychologically trying to survive and kind of trying to stand still. And of course, these triggers to flooding are obstacles because they stop us from being able to engage skillfully in a conversation about our feedback. And we might actually end up making mistakes that cause us to put potentially valuable feedback into the garbage, or just as damaging, we might end up taking to heart feedback that's better left at the curb. So when we're experiencing strong imposter thoughts, it's going to be very important for us to use skills that build us up. That is what we call active coping, as opposed to the ones that drain us. That is avoidant coping strategies, because it is this experience of emotional exhaustion that can contribute to that low satisfaction with your job or with your position. So one of the most effective ways and easiest ways to actively cope is to take 20. And so what that means is to calm yourself, and the fight or flight or freeze system that has kicked in, that is within your autonomic nervous system, it's important to take about 20 minutes to help yourself to maintain your composure. That's going to reduce that flooding and it's going to help give your body some time to calm down. And so consider not responding in that moment to the feedback when you're flooded, because we know that when you're flooded, once again, some of those signs are you feel upset and your heartbeat is like pounding. And we actually know like about 100 beats per minute or greater. Try to take at least 20 minutes to calm before responding, because that's going to help you calm down physiologically before, you actually react. And the way that you can do that is, if you're able to, calm down by like sitting quietly or something like that, you can definitely do that. But you can also, go for a walk, you can listen to some music, you can do something that's going to take your mind off of that trigger or take your mind off of work for 20 minutes. I do want to take a moment here to say that it is not taking 20 minutes to ruminate and to think about the thing that makes you upset. So I've previously worked with couples, and when I tell them to take 20, and then when they come back, they're like, we tried it and it didn't work, doc. Like, I don't know why. And then, I asked one of the members, I'm like, okay, well, what did you do in that 20 minutes? He's like, well, I just sat here and thought about all the ways I was right. So don't do that. So make sure that you take that 20 minutes to disconnect from the thing that was triggering for you, that brought on that flooding response, and to calm down before you re-engage in that conversation. And that's not to say that we're running away and never coming back to it. It is just giving your body some time to calm down so that all those really lovely things about our creative thinking, about our sense of empathy, our ability to respond with reason, all of those things that are disconnected when we are flooded, we want them to come back so that you're likely going to have a better conversation and be able to take in the information. So the next way that we want to talk about in terms of active coping is self-compassion. And so really broadly, this means that we are noticing and treating our internal experiences with kindness and acceptance. So remember that imposter thought that you wrote down earlier? I want you to bring it out. And I want you to write down something that you would say to encourage someone who is having that exact same thought that you have written down. And if you find that that's a little bit tricky, I want you to think about someone that you love, whether it's your child or your partner or maybe a close friend. If they were to come to you and to tell you, Brenda, like I feel like a fraud at work, what would you say to them? So just take a few moments to write down a kind thought that you would share with them, or a compassionate thought. And if you're feeling brave and would like to share a compassionate thought with folks, I would encourage you to type that into the chat, because we could all use more compassion in our lives, I think. I'm just going to give us a few more seconds. Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. You're strong, smart, kind, and capable. If you've never done this before, how are you expected to know? You work hard and you make strides every day. I love that. Yeah, that's really hard. It sounds like you're struggling to feel confident at work. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So please continue sharing, and I'm just going to continue on. Because think about this as folks that are in the same boat as you, really wanting to support one another. Yeah, your expertise motivates and inspires others when you share. Yeah, that's wonderful, Joanne. Okay. So lastly, an active coping technique is looking for things, looking for help with the things that you're struggling with. And so if you're struggling with statistics, that's a sore point for me. That's normal. And also you can look for resources. If you're feeling stressed, that is normal. That's so normal. And you can learn some stress management techniques. Imposter thoughts can be helpful in helping you, like a neon sign pointing towards where you would like to improve. And of course, I always want to put a plug in for mental health and psychological services. Psychological help is a wonderful way to learn active coping strategies in a non-judgmental environment. And it doesn't mean that you are sick. It doesn't mean that you are ill. It does mean that you can have someone coach you and support you in achieving your goals, whether they're professional or whether they're personal. So the next section lies really close to my heart. The image on the screen here is just a large speech bubble that's floating above the heads of all these folks that are walking in this very busy street that we are unlikely to see during COVID times. It's all good. The speech bubble says, all these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. And really illustrating there how common, once again, imposter thoughts are. And I want us to spend the next few slides before we wrap up today talking about how it is that we go from being an imposter to feeling authentic within ourselves. So the next steps that we can take. And so one of the ways that I really love to approach my clinical work is to talk about the values that we have and the ways that we can commit our actions towards becoming the people that we want to become. So often our insecurities and our imposter thoughts point out areas where we have skills deficit. And it can also point out where our passions and our values lie. So this is another reason why I say imposter thoughts can be wonderful, because they can really point out what's important to us and the ways in which we want to become more like the person that we want to become. So what are the different ways that we can seek out opportunities to improve these skills and to act out these values? So the question that I pose here is, what is important to you in your work, and how can you commit to pursuing it even as you feel like you are not ready? So for example, if your value is to be an influential person, might you consider speaking to the media or to write a blog to solidify your thoughts and to state your positions? If your value is to be helpful, might you consider mentorship or helping your peers? If your value is to be a lifelong learner, might you consider attending talks like this one or other ones by BCPA, for example, or in asking questions? And if it's important for you to make professional connections, maybe you might consider attending events or showing interest in other people's work than your own. And as we approach different professional roles, I think it's really important for us to let our experiences teach us, especially our experiences with imposter thoughts. So how do we be supportive and awesome, knowing that we have struggled ourselves? I think it's quite important to be the change that we want to see in the world and to model behaviors of things that have been helpful for us. And so the transformative impact of modeling is super important at work and in our academic fields. For example, if you seek out coaching, if you seek out professional continuing education, that is taking charge of your own academic growth or your own personal growth. If you take responsibility for your mistakes, your peers are going to be more encouraged to be vulnerable and to confess themselves and to take ownership of their own mistakes as well. If you try out a suggestion from a coworker, they are probably also going to be more open to trying out some of your suggestions. And then this modeling effect becomes even more important as you move up in an organization and gain more and more power. So as we've seen over and over again through this presentation, the best way to come out stronger from imposterism is to talk about it with others. So I want to encourage you to think about the ways that you can create spaces where imposterism is open and safely talked about, especially if you hold positions of power within your organization. Okay, so just some final thoughts. Imposter thoughts are really normal and they're learning opportunities. I hope that's something that if you don't take anything else away from this presentation, that you are not alone and you are not weird for having imposter thoughts. Know what events are more likely to trigger imposter thoughts for you. Sharing imposterism and your experiences with it is helpful for ourselves and also for the people that listen to us. So important to re-examine our own perfectionistic expectations and the thoughts that can get us in trouble. Find social support through coaching and mentoring and supports. And active coping is best. So I want you to take a moment to think back to your question at the start of this presentation. And has it been answered? And if it hasn't, now's a good time to share it. And I will take a look at the chat now because I know that I may not be able to hear the questions being posed. I'm seeing some really lovely self-compassionate thoughts. Thank you. That's a funny joke, Jay. Okay. Yeah. So Rebecca asked, when the trigger is experienced, I'm assuming a trigger for that flooding response, what is the best way to handle it in the moment? So you gave the example here, I made a mistake or error, so I must be right about me. Yeah, so, it seems like there's a couple of things there. So when we experience that flooding, I really want to encourage us to think about taking that 20. And I know that it is something that seems counterintuitive, that it's like, oh man, when I get this feedback now, I got to respond now. I got to right the wrongs. And I want to say, again, very strongly that in that moment when you're flooded, when our bodies are feeling overwhelmed, when our minds are feeling overwhelmed, that's actually the place where we're least equipped to respond in a way that's going to be helpful. Because when we're flooded, we know that our bodies are in kind of self-protective mode, and a lot of those higher cognitive functions actually shut down or they're paused. So once again, I mentioned, our ability to be compassionate and to be empathetic, our ability to think creatively, our ability to step into another person's shoes, our ability to creatively problem solve. These things kind of go down the tubes when we're flooded. And so it's going to be very important for our bodies and our minds to settle down a bit before we engage in that conversation that can be quite difficult, because you want to have your wits about you before you have a difficult conversation. So I really encourage us to think about, let's say if you're having a meeting with your supervisor or having a work meeting, and there's a comment that's made that you notice yourself getting flooded. Something that I encourage with my clients to do is to practice a pat response that you can give in that moment to buy yourself some time. And so, for example, with my supervisor, I may say something like, that was a really interesting point, and there's a lot to chew on. I'm going to have to think about it and then get back to you. Can we schedule a follow-up meeting? So it doesn't have to be exactly like that, but when you think about giving a response that you've practiced, maybe even to yourself in the mirror, something that is short and buys you some time, it's going to be really helpful, once again, to help you be able to have that important discussion in a way that's most likely going to be successful. So I really encourage that. And also you'll find that when you're not flooded or you're less flooded, you're going to be a lot kinder to yourself. Because in that moment, once again, all alarms are going. And so that's not going to be very helpful in you being kind to yourself in that moment either. Okay. Do you have any resources for finding a mentor? AC asked. That's a really good question. And that really depends on your particular field and also the kinds of things that you're looking for in terms of a mentor. So it's definitely something that I encourage you to chat about, maybe with folks that are within your professional area. I know that with many professional or academic, different university programs or different college programs, there's often built-in systems or built-in programs like that where you can be connected with a mentor there. And you might also find that within your workplaces, depending on what your workplace kind of establishment is like. And I would say that if you don't have that kind of formal avenue to find a mentor, it's going to be really helpful to, let's say, find somebody that works within your field whose work you look up to. And even if you just invite them out for coffee, invite them out for a chat, that's going to be a really great way to kind of test the waters and see if they might be open to having that kind of collaborative relationship with you. And Jennifer asks, any books you recommend to learn more? I'm going into my master's in counseling, so this is right up my alley and what I'm interested in. Yeah, so Jennifer, I'm actually going to, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to be giving my email out. And so please send me an email. I definitely have some books in mind. There's one on receiving feedback by Heen, I believe. That's really lovely. And I think that may be something that you might be quite interested in. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I have one final blessing for you all before we wrap up for the night. And this is a tweet by Eli Barraza. Embrace imposter syndrome. Revel in the fact that you have fooled everyone. You are a trickster goddess, and you are the imposter child for deception and clever ruses. Go and be well. So once again, I want to thank BCPA for their support and for providing this platform. I just want to bring up here, we talked about, accessing professional or psychological supports. BCPA does provide a referral service to connect you with psychologists within your community if you are within BC. And so for those of you who are in other jurisdictions, I encourage you to look up psychological associations or professional bodies for psychological professionals. And that will be a really great way for you to be connected with someone if you do want to find that professional to support you in your professional growth. So there are other Psychology Month talks that are going to be held throughout the rest of this month. I know there's one tomorrow on dialectical behavior therapy. That's actually probably going to be really great, although I believe it's sold out now. There's also a few talks from psychologists working with children and adolescents for the parents out there, or maybe there's a few adolescents out there, I don't know. Maybe you're all very keen teenagers, in which case, welcome. There's also talks in different languages, and there's a few on stress reduction and also effects of COVID on mental health. So there's lots of very interesting talks that are coming up. And I'm going to leave this slide up here for a moment. Talking about, I know somebody mentioned that one of their imposter thoughts is that their LinkedIn profile is too inflated. I definitely felt a little bit of imposter syndrome creating my first professional website, but it is there if you would like to take a look at it. It is drbrendalee.com. And also I put my email address down there as well. If you'd like to follow up with any questions, I'd be happy to connect you with any resources I may have. And just so for those of you on the cartoon on the right there, it's by XKCD, which is a lovely website. So one person is introducing another person to a third person, and they say, this is Dr. Adams. She's a social psychologist and the world's top expert on imposter syndrome. And Dr. Adams says, don't be silly. There are lots of scholars who have made more significant. Oh my God. So that's just a light comic to end our conversation today. Thank you very much for joining me.